Emily, meet Victoria. She's perfect for Nathaniel.
For my husband?
Emily, please, let me explain.
Then tell me the truth, Nathaniel. What is she doing here?
Emily stood frozen in the dining room doorway, her fingers wrapped tightly around Grace's small hand. Across the room, Margaret raised her wine glass and smiled at the guests gathered around the table. "Everyone," she announced, "I'd like you to meet Victoria. She's exactly the woman this family needs." The room erupted in polite applause, but Emily couldn't move. Her eyes drifted to Nathaniel, standing at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the room. Grace tugged at her mother's hand, sensing something was wrong, though she couldn't have said what. Emily's heart pounded as the pieces of the last 3 months rearranged themselves in her mind, and for the first time, she understood exactly what she was looking at. But to understand how they got here, we have to go back 3 months earlier, before any of this began. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 months earlier, Emily's life looked nothing like the scene we just witnessed. She was 34 years old, living in a modest 2-bedroom house on the edge of a quiet Ohio suburb, raising her 6-year-old daughter Grace largely on her own, while her husband Nathaniel worked long hours at his family's construction firm. Nathaniel's mother, Margaret, had always been a presence in their lives, sometimes helpful, often overbearing, but never anything Emily couldn't manage. Margaret called every Sunday, dropped by unannounced on Wednesdays, and had strong opinions about everything from Grace's diet to the color of the living room curtains. Emily had learned to smile through it, to nod, to let most of it slide off her like water. She loved Nathaniel, and Margaret was part of the package. What Emily didn't know yet was that Margaret had been quietly forming opinions about their marriage for years, opinions she had never once spoken aloud. It started, as these things often do, with something small. Nathaniel came home late one Tuesday evening, later than usual, smelling faintly of a perfume Emily didn't recognize. When she asked about it, he brushed it off, said a coworker had hugged him goodbye after a long project wrapped up. Emily believed him. Why wouldn't she? 11 years of marriage had built a foundation she trusted completely. But 2 weeks later, it happened again. And then again. Each time, there was an explanation, reasonable on its own, but together they began to form a pattern Emily couldn't ignore. She started noticing other things too. Nathaniel's phone, always face down now. His schedule, suddenly unpredictable. The way he seemed distracted at dinner, present in body, but somewhere else entirely in mind. Emily told herself she was imagining things. She was wrong. The woman's name was Victoria Hale, and she had entered Nathaniel's life through the most unremarkable path imaginable, an interior consulting contract for the company's new office renovation. She was 31, sharp, confident, the kind of woman who filled a room the moment she walked into it. Nathaniel later admitted, though not for months, that their first real conversation happened over coffee during a lunch break that ran far longer than either of them intended. There was nothing dramatic about how it began. No dramatic confession, no singular moment either of them could point to and say, "This is where it started." It simply grew, quietly, in the space between long work hours and half-finished conversations at home, until one day Nathaniel realized he was thinking about Victoria more than he was thinking about his own family. What Emily didn't know, and wouldn't learn until much later, was that Margaret had met Victoria first. It happened at the company's holiday gathering, a party Emily had missed that year because Grace was running a fever. Margaret, ever perceptive, ever watchful, noticed the way her son lit up around this new woman, noticed things Emily, exhausted and distracted by motherhood, simply hadn't had the bandwidth to see. Margaret didn't say anything to Nathaniel that night. She didn't need to. She simply watched, filed the information away, and began, in her own quiet and calculated way, to consider what it might mean for the future of her family. Margaret had never been subtle about her opinions, but this time, she chose silence, and silence, as Emily would come to learn, could be its own kind of decision. Over the following weeks, Margaret's Sunday phone calls to Emily grew shorter, more clipped. Her Wednesday visits became less frequent. At first, Emily assumed Margaret was simply busy, caught up in her book club or her volunteer work at the church. She didn't yet understand that Margaret was quietly redirecting her attention elsewhere, meeting Victoria for coffee under the guise of work-related errands, getting to know the woman her son could not stop mentioning. Margaret asked Victoria about her family, her ambitions, her values. She asked the kinds of questions a mother asks when she is auditioning someone for a role she has not yet admitted, even to herself, that she is casting. And slowly, without ever raising her voice or confronting anyone directly, Margaret began building a case in her own mind about what her son truly deserved. By the second month, Nathaniel's late nights had become a fixture of the household routine, and Emily, desperate to hold her marriage together, chose to believe the excuses rather than confront the growing unease in her chest. She threw herself into caring for Grace, into keeping the house running, into being the kind of wife she believed a strong marriage required. She told herself that whatever distance had grown between her and Nathaniel was temporary, a rough patch every long marriage eventually faces. She had no idea that during this same period, Margaret had begun inviting Victoria to small family gatherings, framing her presence as a professional courtesy related to the office renovation, when in truth Margaret was slowly, deliberately, weaving Victoria into the fabric of family life, one carefully orchestrated dinner at a time. Grace, in her innocent way, was the first to notice something had shifted, though she lacked the words to explain what she felt. She began asking Emily why Daddy seemed tired all the time, why Grandma Margaret kept mentioning a new friend named Victoria, why the house felt quieter even when everyone was home. Children absorb far more than adults give them credit for, and Grace absorbed all of it, tucking away each small observation the way children do, without understanding yet what any of it meant. Emily did her best to reassure her daughter, to keep her world steady and safe, even as her own foundation had begun, invisibly, to crack beneath her feet. She had no way of knowing that the ground was about to shift entirely, and that the woman her mother-in-law had been quietly cultivating was closer to the center of her family than she ever imagined. The dinner where everything came into focus was Margaret's idea from the very beginning, though she framed it to Nathaniel as a simple gathering to thank Victoria for her hard work on the renovation project. She insisted Emily and Grace attend, insisted it would mean so much to have the whole family together. Emily, still unaware of the true nature of what had been unfolding around her for 3 months, agreed without hesitation. She spent the afternoon getting Grace ready, choosing a dress, humming along to the radio, entirely unprepared for what awaited her at that table. She walked through the front door of Margaret's house that evening believing she was attending a simple family dinner. Instead, she was walking directly into the moment we opened this story with, the moment Margaret raised her glass and called Victoria the woman this family needed. Standing in that doorway, Grace's hand in hers, Emily finally understood what months of unease had been trying to tell her. Every late night, every distracted glance, every quiet redirection from Margaret suddenly made sense, arranged itself into a single devastating picture. Nathaniel's unreadable expression told her everything and nothing at once, and in that frozen moment, Emily had to decide what kind of woman she was going to be. Not the woman who had spent 3 months explaining away her husband's absence, but someone stronger, someone ready to face whatever truth waited on the other side of that dinner table. What happened next would test every relationship in that room, reshape a family none of them recognized anymore, and force Emily to make a choice that would define the rest of her life and her daughter's future. Emily took a breath and stepped fully into the dining room, releasing Grace's hand only after guiding her gently toward a chair beside her uncle. She would not let her daughter witness whatever was about to unfold without at least the illusion of normalcy. Margaret's eyes met Emily's across the table, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered there, not quite guilt, not quite triumph, something Emily couldn't name. Victoria smiled warmly, extending a hand as though this were an ordinary introduction, as though she hadn't just been crowned in front of an entire family. Emily shook it, her grip steady despite the storm building inside her chest. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice too casual, too rehearsed, welcoming Emily and thanking her for coming. It was the tone of a man performing normalcy for an audience, and Emily heard every false note in it. Dinner proceeded with the strange, suffocating politeness of people pretending nothing was wrong. Margaret asked Victoria to describe her vision for the office redesign, and Victoria obliged, speaking confidently about open floor plans and natural light, while Nathaniel nodded along with visible pride. Emily watched her husband watch another woman, and something inside her went very still and very quiet. She cut Grace's chicken into small pieces, refilled her water glass, smiled when Grace whispered a question about dessert, all while cataloging every glance exchanged across the table. She noticed how Margaret directed conversation toward Victoria at every opportunity, how she praised her judgment, her taste, her work ethic, as though building a resume for a role Emily hadn't realized was open. By the time the plates were cleared, Emily understood this dinner had never been about renovations. After dessert, Margaret asked Emily to help her in the kitchen, a request that felt anything but casual. The moment the swinging door closed behind them, Margaret set down the dish she was holding and turned to face her daughter-in-law directly. "I think you already know why I wanted tonight to happen," she said, her voice low, controlled, devoid of apology. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. "Know what, exactly?" she asked, though some part of her already understood. Margaret studied her for a long moment before answering. "Nathaniel has been unhappy for a long time, longer than you realize. I've watched my son disappear a little more each year, and I won't stand by and watch him settle for a marriage that isn't working." The words landed like a verdict already decided. Emily felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Settle," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret, we have been married 11 years. We have a daughter together. You don't get to decide when my marriage is over." Margaret's expression softened only slightly, though her resolve didn't waver. "I'm not deciding anything, Emily. I'm simply not going to pretend I haven't seen what's right in front of me. Victoria makes him happy in ways I haven't seen in a long time. I only want what's best for my son." Emily stared at the woman who had spent 11 years at every holiday table, every birthday, every ordinary Sunday, and realized she was looking at a stranger, someone who had been quietly rewriting the family's future without ever once including her in the conversation. Back in the dining room, Nathaniel sat across from Victoria, unaware that his wife and mother were dismantling the last pretense of civility just beyond the kitchen door. Grace tugged at his sleeve, asking when they could go home, her small voice cutting through his distraction. He glanced toward the kitchen, some instinct telling him the conversation happening there was not going smoothly, but he made no move to intervene. This hesitation, this choice to remain seated rather than stand and defend his wife, would become one of the defining details Emily carried with her long after that night ended. He had known, on some level, exactly what his mother intended to say, and he had let it happen anyway, choosing silence over confrontation, choosing comfort over honesty, a pattern Emily would soon recognize had defined their entire marriage. When Emily returned to the table, her face carefully composed, she announced it was time for Grace to get to bed. No one argued. Nathaniel walked them to the car in silence, the autumn air sharp against the tension neither of them addressed. As Emily buckled Grace into her booster seat, Nathaniel stood awkwardly by the driver's side door, searching for words that never came. "We should talk," he finally said, and Emily looked at him with an exhaustion that went deeper than the late hour. "Yes," she replied. "We should have talked 3 months ago." She got into the car without waiting for a response, gripping the steering wheel the entire drive home, replaying every excuse, every late night, every quiet warning sign she had chosen not to see until tonight forced her to. That night, after Grace finally fell asleep, Emily sat alone at the kitchen table with her phone in front of her, staring at nothing in particular. She thought about calling her sister, her closest friend, anyone who might help her make sense of what had just happened. Instead, she opened her laptop and began writing down dates, times, every strange detail from the past 3 months that had felt insignificant on its own, but now formed an undeniable timeline. She was not a woman who acted rashly, and she was not about to start now. If Nathaniel and Margaret believed they had already decided the outcome of her marriage, they were about to learn that Emily intended to have a say in her own future, and in what came next, nothing about this family would remain the same. Nathaniel came home the following evening to find the house unusually quiet. Grace was already asleep, her bedroom door slightly ajar, and Emily sat waiting for him at the kitchen table, the same table where she had spent the previous night writing down every fragment of the last 3 months. She didn't raise her voice when he walked in. She simply asked him to sit down. Nathaniel hesitated in the doorway, reading something in her posture that told him this conversation would not follow the same script as their usual arguments, the kind that ended in apologies and forced reconciliation. He sat. Emily slid a single sheet of paper across the table, the dates and details she had compiled laid out in her careful handwriting. "I want you to explain this," she said quietly. "Not to defend yourself. Just tell me the truth, all of it, right now." For a long moment, Nathaniel said nothing at all. He stared at the paper, at the dates that corresponded so precisely with moments he had assumed no one was tracking. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way Emily hadn't heard in years. He admitted that his relationship with Victoria had grown into something he could no longer call professional, though he insisted, almost desperately, that nothing physical had happened between them. Emily listened without interrupting, watching the man she had built a life with unravel his own story in real time. He spoke of feeling invisible at home, of feeling like a paycheck rather than a partner, excuses that might have moved her once, but now only confirmed how long he had been quietly building a case against their marriage without ever once raising it with her directly. "You could have told me you were struggling," Emily said finally, her voice steady despite the ache behind it. "Instead, you let your mother build a courtroom in her dining room and put me on trial without my knowledge." Nathaniel opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, unable to argue with the accuracy of her words. Emily continued, laying out everything she had pieced together: the holiday party Margaret had attended without her, the Wednesday visits that had quietly stopped, the dinners Victoria had apparently attended before Emily ever learned her name. Nathaniel's face grew pale as he realized the extent of what his mother had orchestrated behind his back, a campaign he had been either too distracted or too willing to ignore to notice unfolding around him. He had assumed his silence was neutral. Emily made it clear it never had been. Over the following days, Emily made a decision that surprised even herself. Rather than retreat or demand an immediate resolution, she asked Nathaniel to move out temporarily, giving them both space to think clearly without the daily performance of a marriage neither of them currently recognized. Nathaniel agreed, packing a bag and moving into an extended-stay hotel across town, a choice that sent quiet shockwaves through the rest of the family once Margaret learned of it. Margaret called Emily directly, her tone sharper now, accusing her of overreacting, of punishing Nathaniel for simply being honest about his feelings. Emily, calmer than she had been in weeks, told Margaret plainly that she was done explaining her decisions to a woman who had spent months making decisions about her marriage without ever once including her in the conversation. Word of the separation spread quickly through the extended family, as these things always do, and Emily found herself fielding calls from relatives who had clearly already heard Margaret's version of events before hearing hers. Her sister-in-law implied she was being dramatic. An aunt suggested she consider counseling before doing anything drastic. Emily grew tired of defending a decision she hadn't even fully made yet, tired of a family that seemed more invested in preserving appearances than in acknowledging what had actually happened. Grace, sensing the tension though shielded from the details, began asking more frequently when her father would be home, questions Emily answered as gently and honestly as she could manage. She refused to lie to her daughter, even when the truth was complicated, even when she herself wasn't entirely certain what the future held for their family. 3 weeks into the separation, Emily received an unexpected phone call from Victoria herself, a conversation neither woman had planned or particularly wanted, but one Victoria insisted needed to happen. Victoria explained, somewhat awkwardly, that she had not known Nathaniel was married when their working relationship first began, and that once she learned the truth, she had tried to establish distance Margaret had actively worked to undermine at every family gathering she orchestrated. Emily listened carefully, uncertain how much to believe, but something in Victoria's tone suggested genuine discomfort with the role she had been cast into. "Your mother-in-law invited me to those dinners," Victoria said. "I assumed she had your blessing. I understand now that clearly wasn't true." The revelation reframed everything Emily thought she understood about who bore the greatest responsibility for what had unfolded. Emily sat with that revelation for a long time after hanging up the phone, turning it over from every angle. It didn't excuse Nathaniel's choices, the late nights, the lies, the months of quiet distance he had allowed to grow between them without ever once being honest about what he was feeling. But it did shift something in how she understood Margaret's role in all of it. This hadn't simply been a mother reacting to her son's unhappiness. This had been a calculated campaign, one Margaret had built brick by brick over months, using her position of trust within the family to reshape its future according to her own vision, regardless of the damage it caused along the way. Emily realized she wasn't only fighting to save her marriage anymore. She was fighting to understand exactly how much of her life had been quietly influenced by a woman she had once considered an ally. She began speaking more openly with Nathaniel during their brief, careful conversations, no longer about blame, but about facts. She asked him directly whether he had known his mother was cultivating a relationship with Victoria behind Emily's back, orchestrating dinners under false pretenses. Nathaniel admitted, reluctantly, that he had suspected something, that his mother had made pointed comments about Victoria's compatibility with the family on more than one occasion, comments he had brushed aside rather than confronted. "I didn't think she'd actually do something like this," he said, and Emily searched his face for any sign he understood the deeper failure in that statement. The fact that he had known his mother was capable of manipulation and had simply hoped, rather than acted, to prevent it from touching his own marriage. Grace's school called Emily one afternoon in early November, gently informing her that Grace had grown withdrawn during class, that her teacher had noticed her staring out the window more often than usual, distracted in ways that were unlike her. Emily left work immediately, picked her daughter up early, and spent the drive home in careful conversation, asking simple questions, giving Grace room to share whatever she was carrying without forcing it out of her. Grace eventually admitted she was scared her father wasn't coming back, that Grandma Margaret had told her during a recent visit that sometimes families change, and that she should get used to new people being around. Emily's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she absorbed the full weight of what her daughter had just revealed, the realization that Margaret had extended her campaign directly to a 6-year-old child. That night, Emily called Margaret, and, for the first time since the dinner 3 months earlier, allowed herself to say everything she had been holding back. She told Margaret exactly what Grace had shared, and she made it unmistakably clear that whatever disagreements existed between the adults in this family, involving a child in that conflict was a line that would not be crossed again. Margaret, for the first time in the entire ordeal, sounded genuinely rattled, offering something that resembled an apology, though it arrived wrapped in justifications about only wanting to prepare Grace for whatever might come. Emily didn't accept the apology outright, but she made her boundaries unmistakably clear, telling Margaret that any future contact with Grace would depend entirely on whether those boundaries were respected going forward, with no exceptions and no further discussion necessary. The following weekend, Nathaniel asked to see Grace alone, and Emily agreed, watching from the front window as he knelt down to greet his daughter in the driveway, scooping her into a hug that seemed to hold more emotion than words could carry. Emily used those hours to sit with her own thoughts, uninterrupted for the first time in weeks, finally allowing herself to grieve the marriage she had believed she was building, even as she began quietly imagining what her life might look like moving forward, with or without Nathaniel in it. She thought about the version of herself who had walked into that dinner 3 months ago, unaware and trusting, and she understood she would never fully be that woman again. Something had shifted permanently, and whatever came next would require an honesty this family had clearly never practiced before. When Nathaniel returned Grace that evening, he lingered in the driveway longer than necessary, watching Emily through the window as she moved around the kitchen. He eventually knocked, and when she opened the door, he asked if they could talk, really talk, without the defensiveness that had colored every conversation since the separation began. Emily let him in, and for the first time in weeks, they sat together without an agenda of blame hanging over them. Nathaniel admitted something he hadn't been able to say before, that he had let his mother's opinions carry more weight in his life than they should have for years, not just in this situation, but in countless smaller decisions throughout their marriage he had never fully acknowledged to Emily. It was, in its own quiet way, the first fully honest conversation they had shared in a very long time. Emily didn't offer forgiveness that night, and she was careful not to promise anything she wasn't certain she could deliver. But she told Nathaniel plainly what she needed if there was ever going to be a path back to something resembling their marriage. She needed honesty, immediate and complete, no matter how uncomfortable. She needed him to establish boundaries with his mother that he had never been willing to set before, boundaries that protected their family rather than accommodated Margaret's expectations. And she needed him to understand that trust, once broken this thoroughly, would not simply return because enough time had passed. It would have to be rebuilt slowly, through consistent action, not apology alone. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he nodded, telling her he understood, though Emily had learned by now that understanding and follow-through were not always the same thing. Over the following month, Nathaniel began keeping his word in small but noticeable ways. He limited his contact with Margaret, redirecting conversations firmly whenever she attempted to insert herself into decisions about his marriage. He reached out to a therapist on his own, without Emily suggesting it, and began attending sessions that helped him articulate feelings he had spent years avoiding entirely. He also formally ended all professional contact with Victoria, transferring the renovation project to a colleague and explaining honestly to his employer that a conflict of interest required the change. Victoria, for her part, seemed relieved by the clarity, having never fully understood the role Margaret had cast her into until the consequences became impossible to ignore. Slowly, cautiously, Emily began to notice a version of Nathaniel that more closely resembled the man she had married 11 years earlier. Margaret's absence from their daily lives during this period was noticeable and not entirely unwelcome. Without her constant presence and pointed commentary, Emily found the household settling into a calmer rhythm, one where decisions belonged solely to her and Nathaniel rather than being quietly influenced from the outside. Grace, too, seemed to relax as the tension in the house eased, her teacher reporting improved focus and mood within just a few weeks. Emily understood that healing wouldn't happen on a fixed timeline, and she resisted the urge to rush back into old routines simply because things felt momentarily stable. She had learned, painfully, what happened when she mistook the absence of visible conflict for genuine safety, and she was determined not to make that mistake again, no matter how much she wanted to believe the worst had already passed. By early spring, nearly 6 months after that frozen moment in Margaret's dining room, Emily and Nathaniel sat down together and made a deliberate decision to attempt reconciliation, not as a return to what they had before, but as the construction of something new, built on terms Emily had insisted on from the very beginning. They moved back in together gradually, taking small steps rather than assuming the past could simply be resumed. Margaret, for her part, was informed that any renewed relationship with the family would require respecting boundaries she had never previously acknowledged, an adjustment she found difficult but ultimately accepted rather than risk losing access to her son and granddaughter entirely. It was not the ending Emily would have chosen for herself 6 months earlier, but it was one she had fought for deliberately, with clear eyes and full understanding of exactly what she was choosing to rebuild. Grace's 7th birthday arrived that June, and Emily found herself standing in the backyard watching her daughter chase bubbles across the grass, surrounded by family in a way that finally felt unforced rather than performed. Nathaniel grilled burgers while Emily arranged a table of snacks, the two of them moving around each other with an ease that had taken months of deliberate work to rebuild. Margaret arrived exactly on time, bringing a modest gift and, notably, nothing else. No commentary, no pointed remarks, no attempt to redirect the day toward her own preferences. She had learned, slowly and reluctantly, that her place in this family now depended entirely on respecting the boundaries Emily had drawn, and for the first time in over a year, Emily watched her mother-in-law simply exist within those limits without testing them. Emily still thought, sometimes, about that night in the dining room, the moment Margaret had raised her glass and called Victoria the woman this family needed. She thought about how close she had come to accepting a version of her life shaped entirely by someone else's quiet decisions, how easily that evening could have unfolded differently had she not chosen, in the weeks that followed, to demand honesty rather than settle for comfortable silence. She had rebuilt her marriage, not because rebuilding was easy or guaranteed, but because she had refused to let anyone else decide her family's future without her voice in the room. Watching Grace laugh beneath the June sun, Nathaniel's hand finding hers as they watched together, Emily understood that whatever came next, she would face it as someone who had learned, decisively, never to be frozen in a doorway again.